Hello. So, welcome to another week where we're going through the book of Nehemiah together. So, thank you for joining us. I'm very aware, filming this, of how big my quiff is. Obviously, time for a haircut for me. But yeah, so we're going through Nehemiah. We've been doing, trying to do anyway, a chapter a week. I know we didn't for chapter 2. But this week we're on Nehemiah chapter 5. I'm not going to read it out to you, just like I haven't done previous weeks. So please, if you haven't read Nehemiah chapter 5 yet, press pause, go off, have a read, and come back. And I'm just going to unpack just some of my thoughts on Nehemiah chapter 5 for us. I'm really thankful for Nehemiah chapter 5, I've got to be honest with you, because we've read Nehemiah chapter 3. And from Nehemiah chapter 3, it seems really obvious that all the people are pulling together and they're all working, and things seem really good for the people of Jerusalem. And then you've got Nehemiah chapter 4, which shows that there's some opposition coming towards the rebuilding of the wall from the outside. But you'd still get the impression by the end of Nehemiah chapter 4 that the people in Jerusalem, they're okay. Nehemiah is leading them as best as he can. However, Nehemiah chapter 5 shows us that's not the case. And I'm so thankful for that, because it can be really easy to think, oh, well, when God speaks or when God's moving and God's acting, everything's all right in a community of godly people. And Nehemiah 5 shows me that's not the case. God was moving. God was acting. God was speaking. The people were working on the mission of God. And yet, not everything was okay. There was injustices. There were struggles. There's brokenness and there's sin. That's what Nehemiah chapter 5 reminds me, that actually in a community of God, godly people on this planet, there will still be struggles. It won't all be plain sailing. There will be difficulties, and this is happening in godly communities all over the world. And you might go, why is that? Why is that possible? I'll tell you why it's possible: because of people. We are broken people. We are born into this world, and we aren't perfect, and we don't get everything right. And where you find people, whether they're Christians or not, you'll find injustice and struggles and pain and hurt and brokenness. I know we'd all like to think that's not the case, but it is. And Nehemiah chapter 5 reminds us that Jerusalem and the Jewish people, God's people back then, were no different than we are today. God can still be moving. God can still be working. Great things can be done by a community, but there will still be problems in that community as well. So, what are the struggles in the Jewish community? So, Nehemiah chapter 5 tells us that some of the people were starving, some of the people were in debt, some of the people couldn't make ends meet financially, they didn't have enough money, and there was some serious injustice going on in Jerusalem that was actually being done by the officials and the nobles of the Jews towards their own people. Things don't look good when you hear that, do they? People were starving. God's people were starving. God's people were broke. God's people were in debt. And God's people were being treated unfairly and experiencing injustice because of the godly people who were looking over them, the officials and the nobles. It's not great, is it? And when Nehemiah hears these complaints, and understandably so, he's upset about it because these things shouldn't be happening, but they are. But the people shouldn't have to suffer this. So, does this mean that the rebuilding of the wall project has to stop? No. But does this mean then that we should keep rebuilding the wall and ignore all this stuff? No. No, it's neither of those things, and Nehemiah didn't seem to think so either. Both needed addressing, and Nehemiah did what he could to address both, to make sure that the people were loved and cared for, and to make sure that God's vision and God's project kept going. If I was going to give this week a title, I'd call it Don't Be Blinkered, but Don't Be Distracted. Because I think sometimes we can be so blinkered by what we think God's asking us to do, we ignore all the problems around us. Or sometimes we get so wrapped up in all the problems around us and get involved in them, we lose focus on what God's asking us to do. We should not be blinkered, but we should not be distracted. and Nehemiah wasn't. Okay, God gives us visions and missions and callings and projects for us to do. He has specific purposes for all of us, but we should never forget that God's greatest love will always be what? People. It's for people that God sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die. So we can have a relationship with people. We should never have to make a choice between serving and loving people and serving on a mission project or a calling that God's called us to do. We should always be involved in both because both are equally as important to God. Now, I can already hear some of you going, what? Both? I can't do everything, Steve. How can we do both? You're kidding us. Well, I'm not. Treating people and loving people is every Christian's call. And God has a purpose for you to do as well. And I know it can feel like there's only so many hours in the day, and you would be right. But there's a question that keeps cropping up here at Riverside of last year. What can I do with the hours I've got, with the time I've got, with the resources I've got, with who I am? We can always do something. Nehemiah couldn't solve every personal problem he heard about. Nehemiah couldn't do it. He couldn't physically feed every family that was starving. He couldn't wipe away all the family's debts. He couldn't pay people more to make ends meet. He couldn't make all the injustices go away. But the people still needed help. So what could Nehemiah do? And verse 7 addresses that. Verse 7 tells us that Nehemiah went away and had a think. I think it says in my Bible, he pondered on these things. He went and had a think. And he realised, yes, I can't solve all of these problems directly, but I'm mates with these nobles, with these officials. They are my friends who are acting unjustly. So whilst I can't solve everyone's problem, I can go and talk to these people who are causing the problem because I've got a relationship with them and go and talk to them. Address the problem through relationship with the people causing the problem. He was perfectly placed to do that. He had relationship. They knew him. He was at work. And what did he do? He didn't send a messenger. He didn't write a letter. He didn't send a carrier pigeon. He went in person to talk to the people he had relationship with and challenge them on their injustices in person. This is so important. He could have written a letter. He could have sent a message. He didn't. He went in person. He went to the people he had relationship with and he spoke to them out of the place of his relationship. That's what Nehemiah could do. He couldn't physically feed all the people or wipe away the debts, but he could use the relationships he had to make a difference and to address the problems he was seeing. He could talk to them. There are probably people in your life right now who are struggling. You might know of these people right now, or there may be people in your life that are struggling that you don't know about. It's very easy to say we're too busy to help someone who's struggling. Or it's very easy to say that we can't take away all the problems, so there's no point us doing anything. I mean, we've got to remember, these people who we know who are struggling, these people are loved by God just as you are. We might not be able to completely solve somebody's problem, but we might be able to do something. Nehemiah could not guarantee his actions would have made anything better. Nehemiah could have gone to these people and told them what he was seeing and told them what they should be doing, and they could have just laughed in his face. They could have told him to go away. They could have ignored him. But it didn't stop him. He had to try something. And in this example in Nehemiah 5, it worked. There may be something you can do to help the people in your life that are struggling. You might not be able to solve everything. You might not be able to take everything, but there might be something you can do. Try it. I'm sure Nehemiah went to these people having a conversation going, this is never going to work. But it did. Don't give up before you've even tried. Nehemiah wasn't blinded to loving the people by the rebuilding of the wall. He didn't go, no, God's asked me to rebuild the wall, so I'm going to ignore all the people. He didn't get wrapped up in it. And we sometimes can get wrapped up in our own personal calling or job or mission, whatever you want to call it. So we think we can't get involved in that. But God calls us to love our neighbor. That is, the Great Commission, isn't it? Jesus says the two great commandments, to love God with everything and love your neighbor as you love yourself. We have all got the call to love our neighbors. Nehemiah 5 reminds me that no matter how important the call of God is on my life to do a certain project or thing, it's never at the expense of the people around me. And you know what? I get it wrong sometimes. We all do. We all get wrapped up in our own stuff sometimes. But you know what I found? When I get to that place and I'm becoming too wrapped up in myself, the Holy Spirit just gives me a nudge. And I repent. And then I go again. What can I do? What can I do to help? We can all be doing this. The challenge is, will we? But Nehemiah didn't just speak to the officials. Nehemiah knew that he had to show people a better way. And verses 14 and 15 show us that Nehemiah set an example with how he lived as a leader in that place. He showed the officials and the nobles how they could lead in such a way that made a positive difference in people's lives, so that people could be loved and cared for. That's what leading justly looks like. That's what living justly looks like. Sometimes one of the most powerful things we can ever do is what? Set an example. Show what Christian love is. Show what godly love is. Show what Christian godly values are. Not by telling people what they should do, but showing people a better way by how we live. In fact, nothing does. I think one of the things that winds up the world so much is when Christians are telling people how to live, but they're not living it themselves. Nehemiah knew, yes, the officials had listened to him, but he needed to set an example. That would make a big difference to the officials, and it would make a big difference to the people, and it did. And it brought hope, and it made a difference. We need to make sure that we are setting the example. The world is watching us Christians. Do our lives show that? Nehemiah did this for the love of God and for the love of people around him. What could he do? He couldn't solve everything, but he could try and make a difference, and he did. What example are we setting today? And then there's something we mustn't forget, verses 16 to 18. Whilst Nehemiah was doing this, did he give up on the call to rebuild the wall whilst he did all this? No, he didn't. Did all this stuff that he had to do take away from the work of rebuilding the wall? No, it didn't. Nehemiah kept on leading the rebuilding of the wall project because God asked him to. It's not project or people. It's not one or the other. It's both. And Nehemiah kept doing that. He kept making a difference. He kept doing what God asked him to do. He kept sacrificing. He kept being an example of God's passion, love, and justice. And it's the right thing to do. What did Nehemiah do? He worked out what he could do and did that. All the while still doing what God had already asked him to do. And it's this example that we need to live with. Asking ourselves the question, what can I do, and do that? Ask our question of what example am I setting, and set the best example that we can. When we're faced with the question, should I follow God's calling or should I serve God's people? The answer is yes, both. And then there's verse 19. Stay humble. Nehemiah, I love the fact that verse 19 is there. Thank God, I've tried to do all this, but it's you. I need you. I need your favor. I need your blessing. God is in charge. God is above all. God can move mountains. We don't do it in our strength, but we do it in God's strength. And verse 19 is Nehemiah remembering that. Staying humble. We do this not in our strength, but God's. We need to never forget that as well. It's not about us trying harder. It's about us allowing God to work and strengthen us for His kingdom. Anyway, I've talked too much now, so stay safe, look after yourselves, look after each other, and I'll chat to you soon.